Terrific. Our first paper is going to be by Janice Peterson from California State University at Fresno. Janice, go ahead. Floor is yours.
Good morning. Can everyone hear me okay? This paper looks at economic crises from the perspective of women's experiences in the context of the United States. In the intellectual tradition of Thorstein Veblen, the status of women provides insight into the value systems dominant in society. This paper asks what we learn about US society when we examine economic crises through women's experiences. This discussion focuses on the 21st century crises of the Great Recession and the COVID-19 recession, both of which were assigned gender pronouns, a he session and a she session in popular discourse, reflecting in each case a particular pattern of gender differences or gender gaps in unemployment rates. Feminist institutionalism, grounded in the concept of culture and focused on the influence of cultural patterns and constructions in social provisioning processes, provides a useful framework for this discussion. Examining women's experiences in an economic crisis through the lens of gender draws attention to things that are often ignored, such as the significance of women's continuing responsibilities for unpaid work in the home and community, the consequences of the gendered occupational distribution, and the centrality of care. When addressing the adequacy of social provisioning processes, feminist institutionalism also seeks a multidimensional analysis of inequality. This calls for examinations of women's experiences through additional lenses of significance for them, particularly those of race and ethnicity, drawing attention to the complex web of inequality facing many women as they navigate an economic crisis. The Great Recession in the United States, officially lasting 18 months, was the longest economic downturn in the post-World War II period. The breadth and depth of employment loss in this recession contributed to its distinction as the Great Recession. The disparity in male and female job loss that characterized the economic downturn gave rise to a popular narrative that the recession's gendered employment impacts were so skewed to disadvantage male workers that the Great Recession was in fact a he session and would be more appropriately named the Great Man Session. In this narrative, the disparity in male and female unemployment rates, 10.5% for men versus 8% for women in May of 2009, reflected men's overrepresentation in construction and manufacturing, the industries most adversely affected by the economic contraction, and women's overrepresentation in the sectors least affected by the recession, education, healthcare, and government. The resulting gender gap in unemployment rates was seen by some to have profoundly adverse effects that would create long-term dislocations and structural change for men in the labor market. While for some commentators, the story of the Great Recession was one of women winning and men losing, feminist commentary and analysis illuminated a more complex reality. Feminist economists argued that a complete picture of women's experiences required extending the analysis of the recession's employment impacts to include factors such as race, ethnicity, age, and family structure, as well as gender, in addition to including a wider range of labor market indicators and time spent in unpaid work as well as paid employment. Feminist economists also called for taking a longer view of the crisis, including both the initial downturn and the jobless recovery. Some examples of this research findings, extending the analysis of the recession's employment impacts to include race and ethnicity, shows how comparisons of unemployment rates for all men and all women obscured the fact that some groups of women, particularly Black and Hispanic women, experienced significantly higher unemployment rates than some groups of men, Asian and white men, as well as substantial differences in unemployment rates among women. Broadening the analysis of the recession's labor market impacts to include measures beyond the official unemployment rate revealed, for example, that the additional increase in unemployment experienced by men was not as large when labor underutilization was measured to include discouraged workers and other marginally attached workers, and that involuntary part-time employment increased much more rapidly for women than for men. While the recession narrowed the gap between paid work hours among employed mothers and fathers, this change was not accompanied by fathers taking on more unpaid care work. And as the economy moved into a recovery, job gains in traditionally male-dominated sectors, combined with the collapse of state budgets and deep cuts in areas where women traditionally work, turned the mancession into a he-covery, with men gaining jobs as with women losing jobs. By fall of 2012, employment numbers began to reveal more gender balance in job growth. And by the summer of 2013, reports indicated that a stronger recovery was reaching more women. But as women workers saw increased employment opportunities in this phase of the recovery, trends in other labor market indicators, particularly those involving job quality, raised concerns about the full implications of this job growth for the well-being of women workers. And the growth in low-wage, precarious work throughout the remainder of that decade provides important context for the COVID-19 economic crisis. In the United States, the recession associated with COVID-19 officially lasted 2 months, March and April of 2020, making it the shortest recession on record, followed by an uneven and ongoing recovery. The job loss associated with the onset of the pandemic was staggering, and in contrast to the Great Recession, greater for women than for men. Women of color were most seriously affected, leading some to describe the crisis as having a predominantly non-white female face, and for some to refer to the contraction as a she-cession. The reason most often given for this pattern of job loss was that the sectors hardest hit by the pandemic, such as travel, leisure, hospitality, and educational services, were disproportionately non-white and female. Increases in unpaid care workloads, disproportionately borne by women, and the loss of childcare and elder care options associated with the pandemic and pandemic-related shutdowns further contributed to higher unemployment rates for women than for men. So in some ways, the story of the COVID-19 recession is quite different from that of the Great Recession, and the she-cession narrative has focused attention on the significance of women's continuing responsibilities for unpaid caring labor, as well as the gendered occupational distribution. But placing this narrative in the context of more detailed demographic breakdowns illustrates a commonality between the two crises: substantial differences in employment impacts by race and ethnicity and other factors, and people of color, women and men, experiencing particularly negative employment outcomes. For example, Pew Research Center analysis of BLS data estimating unemployment rates broken down by gender and race ethnicity for February 2020 and May 2020 paints a complex picture of sharp increases in unemployment among all groups, while some groups still experience much higher rates than others. So the overall estimated unemployment rate in this analysis was 13% in May 2020. The unemployment rate for all women was 14.3%, and the unemployment rate for men was 11.9%, illustrating the gendered employment aspects of the COVID-19 recession. But as in the Great Recession, the overall unemployment rates for women and men mask important differences in the experiences of women and men in the economic downturn. For example, the May 2020 unemployment rates for women, 14.3% overall, ranged from 11.9% for white women to 19.5% for Hispanic women, with rates of 16.7% for Asian women and 17.2% for Black women. The May 2020 unemployment rates for men, 11.9% overall, ranged from 9.7% for white men to 15.8% for Black men, with rates of 13.3% for Asian men and 15.5% for Hispanic men. Within race ethnic groups, women's unemployment rates were higher than those for men. But Asian, Hispanic, and Black men all had higher rates of unemployment than for white women. So breaking down the analysis by race ethnicity illustrates the importance of examining women's experiences in the COVID-19 recession in the context of multidimensional inequality and multiple forms of stratification. As the pandemic continued into the fall of 2020, discussion of the special burdens faced by women focused attention on a broader set of labor market indicators. Two job characteristics that have perhaps become uniquely important in this crisis are inclusion in the category of essential workers and having the option to telework. As the COVID-19 pandemic sharply increased the demand for unpaid and paid care, it led to the specification of a new category of workers, essential workers, those workers who should continue providing paid care during the pandemic. According to a New York Times analysis early in the crisis, 33% of employed women fell into this category as compared to 28% of employed men. Non-white women were more likely than anyone else to be doing essential jobs. The essential category includes a large percentage of women working in care services, where in many cases health risks are considered part of the job. And while women have increased their share in higher paying healthcare jobs, they are also overrepresented in the jobs at the lowest end of the wage scale. With the arrival of the pandemic, the ability to work from home emerged as an important job characteristic for reducing both economic insecurity and health risks. The option to telework, however, has varied considerably across different groups of workers. For example, those with a college degree are much more likely to have this option than those with a high school degree. And white women are more likely than Black and Hispanic women to work in the management and financial operations occupations that have allowed work from home. Telework may also collide with women's unpaid work in the home, with research showing telecommuting mothers losing work hours at much higher rates than fathers as the burden of childcare increased. In March of 2021, a year after the initial downturn, some commentators argued that the she-cession really had not materialized, as mothers had been returning to work, bringing them closer to employment levels of fathers. Yet attention to the particular challenges of mothers persisted in popular discourse, noting that while mothers were returning to work, their childcare responsibilities had not diminished, with particular challenges facing women of color.
1 minute left, Janice, sorry.
In conclusion,
Perfect.
Charles Whalen recently observed that the COVID-19 pandemic has forced people everywhere to think perhaps more than ever about what is the economy and its relation to society. It has also forced a rethinking of who we value, what we value, and how we value. These issues are central to institutional economics. Examining economic crises through women's experiences draws attention to the types of work that women do and how it is valued. This provides insight into who we value, what we value, and how we value in our society. Examining the Great Recession and COVID-19 recession through women's experiences shines a bright light on multidimensional inequality and the devaluation of unpaid work and care. This reflects the values of pecuniary culture dominating those of social provisioning, the values necessary for true flourishing. A rethinking of who and what we value must embrace the recognition of the importance of essential work and the centrality of care, paid and unpaid, as well as challenging the sources and consequences of multidimensional inequality. A rethinking of how we value must be rooted in an understanding of the economy as a system of social provisioning and focus on the adequacy of social provisioning processes. This is indeed a worthy agenda for institutionalists. Thank you.
Thank you, Janice. Nice paper. Our second paper is going to be presented by Nick Trebat. Nick, you're on.
Okay, I'm going to just share my screen here for a second.
Good.
Hopefully I can do this quickly. Let's see. Okay. Can you all see that?
Yep, good for me.
Okay.
Go ahead.
All right. Okay. Well, thanks for having me. the name of the paper is Income Distribution, Bargaining Power, and Structural Change in Developed Economies. Unfortunately, my co-author, Carlos Medeiros, is not here today. He wasn't able to be with us. The paper, it's kind of an ambitious paper. And so I'm going to try to limit my talk to just a very few, one or two things, maybe some highlights in the paper, and more stuff that I myself focused on. One of the main, let me switch this slide here. What's the main argument, or one of the main arguments? Technical progress, and to a lesser extent, globalization, lesser extent meaning that we don't discuss it as much in the paper, we focus more on technical progress, is not to blame for the rise in inequality seen in recent decades in the wealthy countries. So we're talking mainly about the OECD countries, and especially the US and Europe. What is to blame? Argument is that's the decline in workers' bargaining power, and we focus in the paper we focus especially on union power. To do so, our basic theoretical background is classical political economy, and we also borrow some ideas from approach that previously I wasn't very familiar with, which is the labor power resources approach, which originated with it's more of a sociological perspective. People like Corpy and Beverly Silver, talking about the different kinds of power that workers can exert as a class. Okay, so the idea that workers' bargaining power is relevant in explaining income distribution trends over the past few decades. Basically, by that we mean comparison of what's called the golden age of capitalism with what came after. The idea is not, a lot of people have come around to the idea, even some mainstream authors such as Larry Summers recently. Our approach here was to take a little bit of a different angle than some of the other some other authors who talked about this, basically the same subject. We focus on what both mainstream authors, mainstream meaning neoclassical, and other more heterodox authors, some Marxists even, what links they see between technical progress and the rise in inequality. And we say that a lot of these arguments that you see in the mainstream approach works like Darren Asamoglu, David Autor, weaknesses in that approach. And we, like I said, we also focus on more heterodox authors that see a link between new technologies, basically digital technologies and automation, and the rise in inequality. And we think there are things that are misguided in both those approaches, and we go into more detail in the paper. We also don't think new technologies are to directly blame for example, the rise in average unemployment rates in recent decades. So I'll just make two quick observations from the paper. The first is the work of labor unions in combating workplace segmentation. And I'm using the word segmentation in a very kind of simplified general way here. When we talk about segmentation in the paper, we basically mean the kinds talked about in the classic paper by Wright, Gordon, and Edwards from '73. But we also mean the type of, he doesn't use this word, but the type of segmentation discussed by Harry Braverman,
I think your slides are supposed to be advancing and they're not.
Oh, they're not advancing?
Correct.
Okay. Yeah, let me see here. How about now?
I think you need to put them into slideshow mode.
Yeah, they're in slideshow mode.
Oh.
Maybe
Now it is. Now it is.
Now you can see it?
Now we can see it.
Oh, good. Okay. Let's see here. Okay, you're seeing labor unions combat segmentation, right?
Yes.
Okay. So anyway, what we basically mean by this is that labor unions combated. They provided resistance to the various ways that firms have always used to divide and control the workforce and to use as much as possible low-wage employees that are more exploitable. And so two of the ways I'll mention here is the union fight for the union policies pushing for the standardization of tasks so that you reduce the discretionary power of supervisors, foremen, managers, etc. And the creation of broad occupational categories. So you try to fit as many workers at as many skill levels of different skill levels as possible into the same job category. So you kind of flatten, standardize the wage distribution in that way. And so we use a paper by Jill Rubery and Piazza from 2016, which talks about how these kinds of policies basically allow higher wage or more skilled workers who usually had influential positions in unions in the US and Europe to transmit their greater bargaining power to lower wage workers. All right. So another important union policy obviously is enforcing compliance with labor laws, which especially in the US is something that became much weaker with the decline in unionization rates after the 70s. So the end result is a lower wage dispersion across skill levels. We also mentioned in the paper the lower wage dispersion along racial and ethnic lines. When we're talking mainly about the US here, when you had higher unionization rates and more union influence in national politics. The second thing in the paper that we mentioned that I'll mention here before concluding is that a comparison between the US and the UK with continental Europe is enlightening here. Obviously, inequality and the rise in average employment rates was something that affected all the wealthy countries over in recent decades. But where workers maintained more power over, more influence in national politics and more influence in the workplace, national politics, we mean where there was a commitment to social democracy was maintained, and where workers in the workplace, we mean where they retained collective bargaining rights. So in Europe, unionization rates also fell in many countries, but in countries where increase in inequality was more mild for countries in coverage rate, the work percentage of workers covered. What do we conclude from this, from the comparison between the US and the UK? The technical progress, we also discussed globalization a little bit, mentioned it, which affected the structure of the US and the European economies in similar ways, and the structure of economic sectors, structure of employment, weren't direct causes of the rise in inequality. The key is worker power. In conclusion, I'll just say that like I said, it was kind of an ambitious paper, maybe too ambitious for the size of the paper, definitely too ambitious. But the idea was to make a kind of connection between this discussion of the rise in inequality in recent decades and the rise to power, the increase in influence of the far right in the US and Europe in the 2010s. So we do discuss that a bit too, but I'm not going to get into that here. We can leave that if necessary to the Q&A. But that's it. Thank you very much. I'll wrap it up here.
Okay, thank you, Nick. It is a very ambitious paper, and hopefully you'll get some comments from the audience about how to focus that ambition a little bit more to get something that is sort of tighter and more publishable. So thank you again. Our third paper is from John Marangos from the University of Macedonia. John, got 15 minutes, or 13 minutes, sorry.
Thank you very much. Nice to see everybody, at least virtually. Alternative economic paradigms to the Greek financial crisis. The goal of the paper is to formulate different answers and policies based on different paradigms as an antidote to the Greek financial crisis. To my knowledge, such noble approach in examining the Greek financial crisis by contraposing the neoclassical and the Keynesian institutional paradigms has not been attempted. Students of the Greek financial crisis and in general of the global financial crisis will benefit from this unique method of economic analysis in deriving, in contradistinction, paradigm-based economic policies to tackle the crisis. In 2009, the European Union statistics agencies, Eurostat, determined that the Greek budget deficit will be around 15.4% of GDP. Okay. The total government debt at the end of 2009 was nearly 300 billion euros. In May 2010, with a debt to GDP ratio close to 120%, Greece accepted a financial assistance from 3 financial institutions: the European Union, the European Central Bank, and the International Monetary Fund. Thus, Troika was born. A bailout package of 110 billion euros was to prevent default, complemented by policy conditionalities consistent with a neoliberal Washington consensus. The peculiarity of the Greek financial crisis lies in the fact that traditional methods such as devaluation of currency were infeasible. Internal valuation, lowering prices, salaries, wages, pensions, and transfers was a natural substitute. The conditionalities required gain in competitiveness, and this gain will be totally produced entirely by internal evaluation. The ineffectiveness of Troika's first economic adjustment program in generating growth and stability fueled the need for further funding. On March 14, 2012, the Eurozone member states and the IMF committed the amounts not dispersed from the first program, plus an additional 130 billion euros for the years 2012 to 2014, initiating the second economic adjustment program. Again, the ineffectiveness of Troika's second economic adjustment program in generating growth and economic stability fueled the need for further funding, but this time under the auspices of a new government. With the rise in power of the so-called radical left Syriza government in Greece, the new government strategy in the first 7 months of 2015 was based on the supposition that a possible Greek default would place in danger the cohesion of the Eurozone. Thus, it was in the interest of the Eurozone members to keep Greece within the Euro umbrella. Instead, and mistakenly admitting Greece's pretense, the Eurozone countries continue to demand a clear commitment from the new government, the new left government, for continuation of the reforms that already had been signed by the previous government. In the end, after various stages in endless negotiations and a hostile EU summit in July 2015, under the threat of exiting the Eurozone, the Greek Prime Minister did a U-turn and was compelled to sign a third economic adjustment program, which marks harsher terms compared to those available to Greece in February 2015. On August 19, 2015, Greece signed with the EU a memorandum of understanding for further financial support up to 86 billion euros, including 25 billion euros to recapitalize the banks over 3 years by the European Stability Mechanism, the new body that had the responsibility of funding Eurozone crisis countries. The new set of constitutionalities, again, were in line with the neoliberal Washington consensus. The irony of the matter is that the conditionalities associated with the third economic adjustment program signed by the so-called radical left government of Greece were consistent with the neoliberal Washington Consensus. For the sake of clarity, the economic adjustment programs imposed upon Greece involved achieving a primary budget surplus, pruning the public sector, reducing social programs and workers' benefits, liberalizing labor markets, raising taxes, reforming the pension system, and a wholesale privatization. On the other side of the fence, a Keynesian institutional approach calls for active government intervention in the form of substantial fiscal stimulus, increasing public expenditure, reducing taxes to the poor, increased taxes to the rich, re-regulation of the labor market, and stopping privatization. In concert with a European Central Bank that functions as a lender of last resort, creating a Eurobond to distribute risk throughout Euro, and institutional arrangements that block the adverse competitive dynamics. In conclusion, after World War I, the reparation plan of defeated Germany imposed unfeasible income transfers from a war-devastated economy that was incapable to produce adequate growth to finance these reparations and maintain social and political order at the same time. Facing the Greek financial crisis, the irony of the matter is that it was Germany that insisted in the devastating income transfers from Greece, and at the same time demanding the participation of the IMF in the economic adjustment programs. The IMF was more than happy to accept the invitation as the door opened in Europe to expand its operations. Moving to Europe, the IMF was carrying in its suitcase the well-known Washington Consensus policies and conditionalities. In this way, Germany made sure that Greece will pay its debt under the auspices of the IMF imposing austerity. In contradistinction, the Keynesian institutional response to the Greek financial crisis, as revealed in Table 1, does not have any commonalities with either the Washington Consensus or Troika's economic adjustment programs. At the end, a question is posed by the irrational individual. Was the economic, political, and social devastation caused by austerity in Greece necessary? In the negative, Keynesians and institutionalists will insist. Thank you.
Thank you, John. And under time, very good.
Great.
And very interesting. Our fourth paper is going to be by Al Campbell of the University of Utah and Erdogan Bakir of Bucknell University. I don't know how you guys are going to do it and how you're going to present, but you've got the floor now for 13 minutes.
Okay, I'm going to do the presentation. So you can see my slides, right?
Yes, we can see them.
Okay. So the title of the paper is slightly different than the one on the program, but it still is about the Kalecki.
We just lost your presentation.
Okay. Now you see it.
Yep, it's back.
Okay, so it is still about the Kalecki profit and profit rate in the post-World War II US business cycles. So this framework is helpful in understanding the determinants of the profit, and it also is helpful in understanding the role.
Erdogan, it would help if you put the slideshow on.
Put what?
Slideshow from the top.
But you see my slides, right?
Yeah, but we'll make it easier if you do the slideshow, because otherwise we're going to be stuck with the same PowerPoint. That's better.
Got it. Okay. So it also is helpful in understanding the role the stabilization policies are playing. Minsky, for example, refers to the Kaleckian profit in relation to the stabilization policies, because the stabilization is all about stabilizing the profit in that framework. Now, the framework is a simple one. The Kalecki basically uses the national income accounting identity to develop this framework in several of his papers. So once you assume the negligible government and closed economy, the gross value added in the national income accounting is the sum of the profits and compensation, which is equal to sum of the private investment and the consumption. Now, the consumption here is made up by capitalist consumption and the workers' consumption. And once you additionally assume that the workers spend all they earn, that equation 1 on the slide becomes equation 2, in which the profit equals private investment and the capitalist consumption. Now, in discussing the proper meaning of this equation, Kalecki refers to Marxian scheme of reproduction. And he basically says that since the workers are being paid less than the value of the product they produce, the profit can only be realized if the capitalists spend on investment and the consumption goods. Even though this is a national income accounting identity, Kalecki talks of this equation 2 in terms of causality, because he says basically the investment and the consumptions are the outcome of the decisions made in the past, and the capitalist, the sales and the profit in the current period cannot be the direct outcome of the past decisions. Therefore, in this equation, investment and the capitalist consumption are the independent variables, and they together determine the profit. So once you relax those assumptions, the assumptions of small government or the negligible government and the closed economy, if you also allow the workers to save, the most general form of Kaleckian profit equation is the one here on the slide, the equation number 3. The profit basically equals the private investment plus capitalist consumption minus worker saving plus government deficit and net export. Now, in a minute, I'm going to show the data on this equation in addition to the components of the profit that I'm going to talk about in a minute. The data do not allow one to disaggregate the consumption into capitalist consumption and the workers' consumption. Therefore, the term in the parentheses here will be represented by the more general term, which is the total consumption minus compensation. So from the Kaleckian profit, the Toporowski, following Toporowski, basically we write the Kaleckian profit rate, which is basically the profit deflated by the capital stock. The only difference between this equation 4 here and the equation 3, the Kaleckian profit, is that the profit here is described as the net of depreciation. Therefore, investment and the capital stocks are also net of depreciation. So in addition to that, we basically disaggregated the private profit into its components because the capitalist class is not the homogeneous group. They have different propensities to consume and to invest. Therefore, it is important to disaggregate the profit into different components to see how to see their dynamic, basically. So the profit in equation 5, the private profit is basically proprietor's income, rental income, net interest income, net dividend income, and what undistributed profit, which is what Kalecki calls the corporate saving. Now I'm going to show the data very quickly about equations 4 and 5. Then I will talk about a little bit the implications of the data. Now, we looked at this framework is specifically proper in the business cycle analysis because it is a short-term analysis. We looked at the equations 4 and 5, the Kalecki profit rate and the components of the profit in the business cycle context. There are 11 business cycles since the late 1940s in the United States, full business cycles from trough to trough. Since I'm constrained by the time, I'm going to just talk about the different periods. Here, we group these cycles into 3 different periods. The first 4 cycles is the Golden Age cycles, and then cycle 5 and 6, the transitional period of 1970s. And then the cycles 7 to 11 are the neoliberal cycles. Now, I'm going to just talk about the averages of these cycles here. Now, there are a few important changes since Kalecki wrote about this framework. When you look at the determinants of the profit rate, one important change is the significant drop in the contribution of the net private investment to the profit rate. Net private investment accounted for 39% of the profit rate in the Golden Age. It now is accounting only 27%, accounting for 27% of the profit rate in the neoliberal period. Now, the contributions of the government deficit to profit rate only marginally changed from Golden Age to the neoliberal period. And another important change was the change in the contribution of net export. It was marginally contributing to the profit rate in the Golden Age, 2.2%, but it is now negatively contributing to the profit rate in the neoliberal period, negative 13.4%. Of course, once the net contribution of net private investment is declining and net export is negatively contributing to the profit rate, something has to change to stabilize the profit rate, and that is basically the consumption minus compensation. And that dramatically increased from 25% to 53%. It more than doubled from Golden Age to the neoliberal period. This is important because Kalecki was specifically focusing on the net private investment, and he discussed some alternative mechanisms through which the profit can be influenced. But those alternative frameworks didn't play much role when he was writing about this. When you look at the components of the profits, the numbers in brown here on the slides, again, there are a couple important changes. The proprietor's income and undistributed profit, along with the rental income, all dropped from Golden Age to the neoliberal period. What increased was the net interest income and the net dividend income. And in other words, what John Robinson and the Kalecki were calling, there was a favorable redistribution of the profit towards the rentier from enterprises. Now, I have, I think, 3 minutes left. Before I talk about some concluding remarks, I want to show the numbers. We did these calculations for the cycles, also for the expansionary and the recessionary periods of the cycles. So these are the expansions in each cycle. So the cycle 12 here is the current expansion that we are in. After COVID-19 recession ended in the second quarter of 2020, and the data that we are using in second quarter of 2021. And one of the stabilizing factor for the profit rate in this current expansion is, of course, the increase in the government deficit, and the consumption minus compensation still continues to be very important in stabilizing profit in this current neoliberal expansion. but when you look at the net private investment, basically it recorded the lowest of all cycles, which is even lower than the recessionary cycles of the golden age cycles. And another important change is almost the quarter of the profit went to the dividend earning shareholders. So the conclusion, okay. So even though Kalecki emphasized the critical role played by investment, there were some significant changes under the neoliberal period, which became important in understanding the dynamics of the profit in this period. Neoliberalism has involved substantial redistribution of income from enterprises to rentier and shareholders. Kalecki talked about how as long as this offset the negative effect of the decline in the corporate saving on investment, the net outcome is going to be negative. But the net trade deficit was also declining significantly in this in the neoliberal period. Therefore, the consumption minus compensation has to increase much more than the decline in the net investment to stabilize the profit. Now, given the stagnant wages, what was driving the staggering increase in the consumption minus compensation in the neoliberal period were three things. The asset price index consumption, that finance consumption, and the redistribution of income to high spending managers from low spending capitalists. That's it. I think yeah. I will answer the additional questions during the Q&A.
Steve, we can't hear you.
You're still muted, Steve.
Sorry. Thank you, Erdogan. And thank you for keeping to your time and even keeping time yourself.
Yeah.
Our fifth paper is from Brian Lin of the National Chengchi University. Brian, you've got 13 minutes.
Okay, thank you, Steve. So my paper title is MMTO Public Enterprises, a Contribution to Economic Sustainability. So in this paper, first I will briefly describe the background and then followed by MMT. The section 3 is sustainable finance. Then I will talk about public
You want to put
enterprise.
on the slideshow? Make it easier for everybody and yourself, especially.
Okay.
There should be something up on the top that says slideshow. And if you click that, up at the very top, in the brownish color, there should be something that says, when it's translated into English.
Let me ask my daughter to help me.
You can also go to Steve. You can also go to the slideshow from the bottom as well. The second to right icon there at the bottom will take you to a slideshow.
F5 would be probably easiest if you can do it. F5. Yeah. Thank you, Gail.
刚刚那个画面怎么不见了？
Try F5. If you hit F5, that might do it.
Bottom right next to the slider, there's that little picture icon toward the very bottom right. If you
Oh,
click
thank
that,
you, Robert. Yeah.
Yeah.
sure.
That's the other one, yeah.
，button right 是哪里？这个啊
正在分享，这样有看到吗？
Down at the bottom, where see where it says 69%, and that's it. You got it. Click.
Is this screen okay for you?
Can you click? Ah, well,
这个呢？
嗯，
这个怎么把它这个把它缩小？
这样
Is this screen okay for you?
it's fine, but you're going to have to keep clicking on the different numbers every time you go down to PowerPoint. It just makes it a little bit more difficult. If you want to do it that way, that's okay.
Yeah. Okay. So let me do that this way. Yeah.
Okay.
So the first I just called a Nobel Prize winner Meadow. According to Professor Meadow, he says that public finance represents economic planning. That is positive intervention and not just an automatic mechanism as in the abstract theory of harmony. And then just from the latest Sweden government office, I quote this, state-owned enterprises represent a huge wealth and are ultimately owned by the Swedish people because public enterprises are very important to the Sweden economy. So in this article, I would like to emphasize the government obligation responsibility from the perspective of sustainable finance for economic sustainability. So the second session will discuss MMT, and then third session will talk about the current practice of the US sustainable finance and the EU sustainable finance, and then discuss the global institutional planning development, along with the EU and the Swedish public enterprises, and then make a quick conclusion. Okay, so the MMT basic described by Professor Ray and Bell. Well, here I do not argue their standpoint is not wrong, but they emphasize that government can always print money to finance expenditure. Well, in principle, I guess this is feasible, not a problem. But just from my perspective, especially from the perspective of sustainable finance, I would say this is not probably the main institutional coordination and cooperation between the Fed, the central bank, and the Treasury. As I will show later, they have other sustainable obligation. But here I would first mention that MMT, from what I have seen, little has been said on how to practically determine the amount of real resources. And so we have very limited idea about the economic outlook for the future. And here, if we check the Germany Federal Ministry of Finance, so the fifth report, sustainable report, is very clear. So sustainable finance are essential for enhancing German sustainability. And so according to that Germany report, sustainable finance do not just allow the state to take action in a timely manner to promote sustainable growth, but they are also a prerequisite to intergenerational equity and the social cohesion. So now if we look at the institutional coordination and the link between the German Ministry of Finance and the German Central Bank. So in Germany, the ratio of debt to GDP in 2020 has fallen below the 60% threshold. And also the German federal government has adopted comprehensive fiscal measure. And according to the German Central Bank, the central bank said Germany has sufficient financial leeway to further expand its expenses assistance to households and enterprises. And one of the main reasons is that Germany experienced a budget surplus before the outbreak. And also the German central bank emphasized that it's very important to take the input of academia, politics, and the society as a whole when design or review a monetary strategy. So from here, we can see the institutional coordination and the cooperation between the German Ministry of Finance and the German Central Bank. And now for the US recent development, the first is in December 2020, the US Federal Reserve joined a very important international network of central bank and the supervisor for greening the financial system called NGFS. So almost all the central bank in the world have joined this global network. And the vision for this international organization is to take the environment and the climate risk into the best practice in the financial sector. And in terms of the US Treasury, the US Financial Stability Oversight Council, FSOC, was chaired by the Treasury Secretary. And for the first time, released a report in last year, October, and identified climate change as an emerging and increasing threat to US financial stability. So at the end of this report, the FSOC has made 4 recommendations as follows. And also the FSOC emphasized the importance of the domestic and the international coordination for FSOC member to promote the US financial stability. So this FSOC has 10 voting members. Of course, the Treasury Secretary is the chair, and also including the chair of the board of the Federal Reserve System. And in terms of the EU, EU has a very clear definition about sustainable finance. Sustainable finance actually refers to the institutional process of taking environmental, social, and the government, so-called ESG, into account when financial institution or government authority make investment decision to promote sustainability. So later called the EU Action Plan on Financing Sustainable Growth. That was adopted by the EU in March 2018. So it has the following 3 objectives. So the EU action actually is to integrate finance and the sustainability via a comprehensive action plan. And actually the EU has recently developed the so-called sustainability taxonomy. So this taxonomy is very comprehensive. It's a detailed classification system of environmental and the social sustainability activity for investors. So like for the green bond, so you have to meet several requirements in order to be certified as a green bond. The next is about economic planning for sustainability. Well, first we know that in the US, the dominant corporate planning has been well analyzed by institutions like Professor Galbraith and Monker. So I believe big corporations have to great extent continue to dominate the US economy. So the real issue that remains unclear is the extent to which they affect society as a whole. But right now, we have seen that the standard of sustainability have become more and more important. So here I just use two big US exchange, that the ICE and the Chicago Mercantile Exchange, ICE and the CME Group. So for example, like ICE Group use the standard set by Sustainable Accounting Standard Board and the UN SDG to measure and drive their effort for sustainability. And then in terms of a CME Group, they use a mix of standards to determine the characteristics of sustainability for the purpose of a transaction. So, so just by judging these two big exchange group, we can see that right now more and more company, especially large company, they have to legally or follow the various standards of sustainability set by domestic or global organization. So, and at the same time, I guess we can also clearly recognize that the mainstream concept of a free market system cannot align well with the current standard of sustainability. Finally, it's about public enterprises. And then I would argue that the public enterprises are the state default. Okay, public enterprise are the state default. So if we ask this question, can the government initiate a sustainable plan from an institutional perspective in a timely manner? And then actually, US President Joe Biden last year, just December, a month ago, issued an executive order. And so this is called a federal sustainability plan. And now this plan have several ambitious goals. And one goal is to achieve reducing the federal building emission, the carbon emission by 50% by 2032, and achieve net zero emission building, campus, and installation by 2045, net zero emission. So the CEQ Council on Economic Equality will implement the first ever federal building performance standard to achieve this goal. And a very interesting part for this is that actually in this plan, this report especially mentioned the USGBC, the so-called leadership in energy and environmental design as the certification. Now, if we look at the EU and some like Sweden, here for Sweden, the portfolio of a state-owned enterprise is very important. So right now, at this moment, in Sweden, there are 46 enterprises and around 135,000 employees. So the dominant sector is basic energy, industry energy, with more than 50%, and then followed by property, telecom, and the services. And this is a Swedish airport operating company called Swedish Aguiar. So actually, complete the mission of international role model in sustainability assigned by the Swedish state. Okay, so the Swedish government just assigned this a duty to this company. So right now, all airport operation under the auspices of Swedish Aguiar had become fossil-free in 2020. So as a result,
1 minute left, Brian.
okay, thank you. So as a result, they got innovation award. So my conclusion is, so without timely adjustment of the socio-economic institution for aligning government policy measures from the short term to the long term, then economic sustainability cannot be achieved and warranted, even if the government just choose to print more money to pay for its bill. And then as Sweden has clearly shown, the Swedish government and the parliament, they have adopted various pieces of legislation and policy instrument to lead public and public enterprises toward broader institutional coordination. So my final conclusion here is that we can highly anticipate that public enterprises will become more and more relevant for promoting economic sustainability. So in this case, I think the government should not only just set sustainable guideline principle for private company, but the government can also directly initiate the state default. The state default is public enterprises to promote economic sustainability. So that's my presentation. Thank you.
Thank you, Brian. I think that's a presentation and a paper that Gunnar Myrdal would have liked a lot. So thank you again.
Thank you.
Our last paper is from John Komlos, University of Munich. John, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Let me see if I can share my screen here with you.
Looks good.
We got it. Okay. So my story is about Black-Swan, which is a metaphor, as you know, for a high impact, low probability event popularized by Nassim Taleb. And I think it's important because it has not been integrated into economic thinking. And I believe that we should pay serious attention to it, to the concept. And obviously we're in dangerous territory. I don't have to emphasize that. Before COVID, the idea was that the economy is in good shape. And that goes back all the way to 2016. Marty Feldstein stood up at the American Economic Association meeting in January 2016 with 500 people at least in the room and said that the economy was in good shape. I have a recording of it and could play it, but I don't think I should in the 13 minutes. It's incredible. The US economy is in good shape. We're essentially at full employment and all this type of thing, but the reality was very different, pretty clearly. I call the U6 the true unemployment rate. At the time was something like 15%, 16% among African Americans, and that is something that he completely disregarded. Those without a high school diploma among African Americans, 32% had a U6 unemployment rate of 32%. And Marty Feldstein said that we were in good shape. Okay, well, the economics profession is in bad shape if that's the way they think about things. And life expectancy was going down even before COVID. Let's not forget that. That is a big indication that things were not looking up for us. And then, of course, came COVID and really did a trick on us. Unemployment rate, U6 unemployment rate shot up above 22%. And these are the consequences of a society that is not a black swan robust economy. And I think that is what we should be set as our goal. And in the 21st century, we've been hit time and again with black swans. So it seems to me that it's about time to integrate that into our idea. What is an efficient economy? Okay, an economy is not efficient if it's only thinking about short-term developments. And of course, we have a lot of potential black swans around the corners. So it seems to me that this should not be disregarded. Obviously, spending on safety is unpopular. We have a mental bias that guides us to immediate gratification. We have present bias and hyperbolic discounting, and all this makes it difficult to plan for future black swan events. Our mortality rate in the US was among the worst in the world and under COVID. Let us not forget that we were not a stable economy to begin with. That is one thing that I want to emphasize, that we were in endemic long run disequilibrium. Okay, endemic long run disequilibrium, and the COVID really magnified the various discrepancies in the economy. And the mortality rate is a good indication that we're not as well capable of dealing with such events as other economies. You can see only Brazil did worse than we did, and there were quite a few economies that were close to us, but most of the economies did much better. Okay, so that should give us some pause. Now I'll get back to the unemployment rate. I calculated the true unemployment rate and it was even above the U6 rate. So the official unemployment rate is usually about half of the true unemployment rate. And by true unemployment rate, I mean that I include a part of those part-time workers who are not able to get a full-time job, who want a full-time job and are not able to get a full-time job. I consider them a third unemployed. And then I also consider those who want to work but have had given up looking for work also as unemployed. And in 2020, these numbers were around 6 million. So a major proportion of the unemployed are overlooked in the official unemployment statistics, the headline statistics, and that's quite problematic. Now, it's interesting to compare the US to Europe in this regard, and here I'm using the official unemployment rate. And as you can see, it shot up quite a bit in April and dissipated over time. And Canada and the US were two economies that responded in that way. Spain was high to begin with and remained high, but relatively flat, as well as all the other countries remained relatively unscathed. So that's different, kind of interesting differences in the response. How does the recession compare to other recessions? Well, 2020 was pretty deep, went down by more than 10%, but we came up again rather quickly. Similar to 2001 in that regard. The 2001 recession was very shallow, but it was over pretty fast. Then the 1990 recession here, 1980 with its double dip and lasting for a long time, and 2008 recession, which really dragged out quite a long time. So I thought that would be kind of interesting. Now we have to consider how that came about and how the bailouts, capitalism, excuse me, we morphed into a kind of bailout capitalism is the way I believe happened, because the Federal Reserve squeezed an incredible amount. On this graph, you see from 4 trillion to 7.5 trillion, $3.5 trillion in a matter of months. Okay. $3.5 trillion. And you can see that the unemployment rate, this is the official unemployment rate, turned around pretty quickly. Within a month, by April 15th, it was it's dissipating, but look at the different rate of dissipation among whites, Hispanics, and blacks being the slowest. We can also look at the GDP per capita, and that's only released quarterly. So the turnaround appears a little slower, not surprisingly, but obviously tied to the bailout capitalism that I just referred to. Okay. And then comes the stock market, was very, very high to begin with. The price earnings ratio were very high. Obviously, we were in an asset bubble to begin with, thanks to the earlier bailouts of 2008. Here's Bernanke's bailouts. We basically went from under $1 trillion for the Federal Reserve to, well, 7.5 trillion here, but we have now exceeded $8 trillion. So it's a factor of 8. And I have great reservations about that. Here is a closer depiction of 2020. March 11th, from 4 trillion to March 21st to 5 trillion, about $1 trillion within 2 weeks. Okay, that's big bucks. And as you can see, the Dow Jones responded almost within a week with to the bailouts. Okay, so we have money creation that is driving us out of this recession. And that's what I call bailout capitalism. Of course, the national deficit has been accumulating ever since Reagan in a big way, and even before before COVID, we ran a national debt of $1 trillion per annum. Here it is per administration on an annual basis, and you can see in 2021 money, Reagan's deficit was already $1 trillion per annum for 8 years. Okay. And under Trump, it said it hit 1.6 trillion. So what I'm arguing
John.
is,
Oh, perfect.
Okay.
You're on your conclusion. Go ahead.
you're right. The pandemic struck the underbelly of a vulnerable, high-pressure economy that didn't put any money aside for Black Swan type events. It was a frail economy. Our system is in endemic disequilibrium and therefore can be easily destabilized. COVID is a magnification mechanism. The fragility is magnified by the virus. And it was, of course, not an inclusive economy. It's a gig economy with precarious jobs that's not going to have a lot of stability. Insufficient savings and insufficient safety net makes it a problem. And the goal of policymakers to reboot the economy is short-sighted, in my opinion, because what we should be aiming at is to creating a new economy that is robust to Black Swan type events. This will obviously need institutional innovation, far-sighted policies, and a new Keynes for our time. And failed sales strategies, by the way, like in structural engineering, that we really need to think about that. And what I advocate is a capitalism with a human face, which I think would be such an economy. And you can read more about it in my textbook. And I appreciate your attention. Thank you.
Thank you, John. I especially liked your bashing of Marty Feldstein at the very beginning.
Yeah.
Marty Feldstein, I regard that as a black swan, but as the black sheep of the economics profession. For those of you who are too young to remember, in the 1970s, Feldstein published a paper which argued that Social Security reduced savings rates in the economy and the net effect was zero. And then two economists, I think they were from the Department of Labor, attempted to replicate the paper and found out that there was a problem, and when you corrected the programming problem, then Social Security had no effect at all on savings. And that wasn't the bad part, because we all make mistakes, we're all human. The bad part was Feldstein's response, which was to blame the whole thing on his graduate assistant. So for that, he deserves being the black sheep of the family, and for people bashing Marty Feldstein whenever possible. So thank you, John.
You're welcome. Anytime, just call on me. I could play the video if you're interested.
No, I think it would be better if we spent our time doing the Q&A. We've got 33 people here. If it doesn't get chaotic, and again, my goal is to reduce the crises and upheavals here, you can unmute yourself and talk. If it does start to get chaotic with lots of people talking or trying to talk at the same time, we'll have people use the raise the hand function. So any questions? Is there a first person that would like to start? Nobody's going to start. I'll start. I've got a few questions for people. Oh. Anybody? Okay, let me let me start, and maybe a question for John Marangos, which is about Greece and the Eurozone. And John, you did a good job sort of summarizing the financial problems for Greece and alternatives. And my question really stems from a famous book by Albert Hirschman, Exit and Voice. And the thing that I've always wondered about with respect to the Greek crisis is why the hell didn't they exit? Because certainly staying in the euro gives them no voice. They have no voice. And the economic consequences are severe.
Exactly, exactly. I totally agree with you, Steve. And the issue was that they didn't want to let us leave. Okay. Of course, you know, going bankrupt and moving, you know, exiting the euro would have resulted in a substantial loss to the European banks. Okay. At the time in 2010, Greece had the power to destroy the euro. Okay. And we could have negotiated a lot more better then. However, our politicians did not take that advantage. Okay. And at the end signed the first economic adjustment program, you know, and calling in the IMF. By then, the European banks and the European governments offloaded Greek bonds. And by 2015, when the radical left government supposedly came into power, they believed that they will be able to renegotiate a program, you know, with a substantial haircut to the debt. Okay. But then the Europeans were ready and said, you know, you can leave now. Okay. The impact of a Greek exit will be substantial less in 2015 than in 2010. Okay. So from that point of view, you know, I agree with you that, you know, in 2010, we had the power to use that card of exit. By 2015, we couldn't. Even though to point out that a referendum where the government, the left-wing government, asked the people should effectively sign the third economic adjustment program, and 62% of people said no. So the government even went against the wishes of the majority of the people and signed the third adjustment program in the name of staying within the euro. And the third program was the harshest program. Okay. By the end of the program in 2010, the Europeans were fed up with the Greeks and they let us loose. Not because we achieved the targets, okay, based on the third adjustment program, but because by now they had lost interest in Greece and they already had saved the money. Thank you.
Okay, good. Thank you, John. Anybody else?
May I put a question?
Go
John?
for it, Wolfram.
Yeah, quite naive, two naive questions, perhaps to Erdogan and Campbell. I found that very interesting because it shows, it lets us take glimpses into certain mechanisms of financialization and how financialization applies internal redistribution processes from real investment to financial profits, etc., etc. Now the questions: how would appear in your equations the buying up of own shares that has become a fashion among the top ranks of corporations? And second, how would the top management bonuses, which sum up to hundreds of millions at some corporations, would appear as wages, or is it part of net profits or gross profits, whatever? Yeah, that would be my little question marks. Thanks.
Shall I go ahead?
Yeah, take it.
We actually talk about them in the paper, but because of the time constraint, we didn't touch upon them. The Kalecki himself looked at the period of 1926-1929 when the stock market was overvalued or was increasing in the United States at the time, and to see if there's a disconnect between the capitalist consumption and the capitalist income. And he basically said that the data basically do not show evidence for the overvaluation of the stock market influencing the capitalist consumption. So therefore, he sort of, but based on the data, he disregarded that explanation. But of course, that changed with the neoliberalism. Asset price inflation became significantly important in the consumption in both capitalist consumption and the consumption of the household as well, and especially the real estate asset price inflation of the early 2000s. So it wasn't only the capitalist consumption being influenced by the asset price inflation under neoliberalism. It was also the huge part of the U.S. households increasing their consumption independently of their income. So that was one important change with the financialization that you mentioned. And the other change, and Kalecki also talked about the managers. And he basically said that the assumption of workers spending all their earning is not a reasonable assumption. Let's separate the managers from the workers who truly rely on their income. And the managers whose incomes are changing in relation to the capitalist income. But he said at the same time, since this is basically the redistribution of income from corporate saving towards the manager, the overall effect of this is going to be negligible. Whatever is going to increase in terms of the managerial consumption is going to be offset by the decline in the private investment due to the lower corporate saving. But that also changed with the monopolization and the financialization, as you mentioned. There's now a quite substantial literature about how the investment has declined in the United States as a result of the concentration. And so that basically means that the redistribution doesn't necessarily have to come at the expense of lower investment. Now, and also the managerial class, of course, the whole relationship between managerial class and the capitalist class became more nuanced under the neoliberalism. As you mentioned, for example, a stock option is one of the way the consumption of the managerial class can be influenced. So all these changes basically made significant changes in the determinants of the profits since Kalecki started to write about this. But the interesting aspect of this is just one final point, and both John Robinson and Kalecki talk about how the redistribution of income towards the rentier or the lack thereof might dampen the realization of the profit. In other words, if you have the redistribution, these people have to spend in order to realize the profit, and that's something that you see in the data. There is a huge redistribution of income towards the interest earning capital and the dividend earning capital under the neoliberal period. And you also at the same time see how much consumption, the capital's consumption and the managerial consumption became important given the decline in the contribution of the investment and of course the trade deficit. I don't know if I answered your question. But...
Well, yes, perhaps one remark. I mean, you might go somewhat deeper, perhaps, in the mechanisms of financialization in terms of fictitious capital. You know, the bubble seems to be a generating bubble, which is individually rational, but collectively, of course, irrational. But it's a mechanism anyway, increasing the bubble, and then expecting at the same time, and these people are clever, of course, and know everything more or less, expecting the next crisis and the meltdown of their fictitious capital, and the mechanisms of changing the fictitious capital into whatever world harvests, resources, land grabbing, blah blah, in order to, at the end, when the crisis comes, having more real value that would survive the meltdown better than fictitious capital. That would be something, a redistribution mechanism at the expense of real manufacturing profits, right, in favor of the financial profit. And in favor of the entire society of workers' class, public sector, etc. So in a sense, you might extend your view over a cycle, you know, or into a dynamic, into the future of a structural crisis emerging. Well, just a rough suggestion.
Yeah,
thanks.
I agree.
Anybody else? Questions, comments for any of the presenters? Go ahead, Janet.
Yeah, so I have a question for Janice. So I really liked your paper. This might tend a little bit more toward the political rather than political economy, but it strikes me that early on in the pandemic, and if you remember, like the applause for the essential workers, mostly nurses, or all the people saying really nice things to, you know, grocery store clerks, mostly women. And just seeing the news recently, it seems like that has gone completely in the other direction. And so, you know, there's different ways we value people. You know, we do see wages rising a little bit, but then there's this other really dangerous trend. I mean, the woman, the flight attendant who had her teeth knocked out. So I just wanted you to maybe put that in context, if you can.
Well, the question about, you know, valuing the essential workers, you said there was, you know, this great outpouring for them, but it didn't take too long before there were even, articles by grocery store workers saying a couple months ago, everybody's thanking us. And now they're, you know, being belligerent and, you know, unhappy with us because there's no toilet paper or, you know, things like that. And so it happened fairly quickly. And the folks on the front lines, you know, saw it and felt it. And so I think that's, yeah, I mean, it's hard to know what, you know, what to propose about that, except, I mean, a major change in the way we value people. You know, everybody was thanking the grocery store people when everyone was afraid they weren't going to be able to get the things they need, right? But you know, ultimately, they really don't value grocery store people and are back to being snarly toward them. And you know, many of these people are women and they're people of color, and I think that's part of it as well. And I do think there needs, you know, there does need to be sort of a sea change in valuing. And And I think that it's part of the bigger change in the way we value things that's related to environmental sustainability as well. That, you know, and so, yeah, I mean, I think that that has that's an important observation, and it's, you know, and it's something that's relevant for, you know, public policy, the way workplaces operate, but also I think the way we value things in general. So I think that that's a very good observation and good point. And I wish I had some really good insight on what to do about it.
Well, there's also the issue of a lot of these problems coming from the top. You know, people are frustrated, and then they have to deal with corporate bureaucracies that basically tell their frontline employees what they're supposed to do. And they risk losing their jobs if they don't do what they're told to do. And so you've got these people on the front lines that they're caught in the middle. They're dealing on the one hand with a corporate bureaucracy that is depending on, you know, that requires them to follow the rules or they're going to lose their job. And on the other hand, they're dealing with disgruntled people who are disgruntled because the economy's a mess and we do have to be careful because of the health problems. And what are you going to do? And yeah, you're right to focus on people need to be better, but there also needs to be a focus on corporations need to be sensitive to this, and the sensitivity needs to extend beyond the platitudes that spew from the corporation when there's a problem.
Well, and I think that, you know, I mean, that's what's calling for, you know, institutional change. And I'm thinking to our paper about, you know, worker power and inequality and, you know, a return to robust labor institutions, you know, it very much applies to that. I think that's an important piece there. Yeah, thank you.
No, absolutely. Good. Anyone else? John, go ahead. John
Yes, Steve,
Watkins.
your comments, actually, I don't mean to take away anything from the care workers, and I mean they perform such an important service. But Steve, your comments also would apply equally to academia and what we're currently going through, because we're getting enormous pressure from the administration. I know we did in the summer of 2020 to appear in person, and they didn't seem to give a shit about the well-being of the faculty. All they're concerned with is, of course, maximizing revenues, and I think that continues. So,
and that's always been the case. It's,
yes,
you
it
know,
has, but
it's the administration looks at the students as consumers, and the faculty look at students as sort of, these are people that we can sort of challenge and teach and get to up their game by a couple of notches.
yeah, but when our life is on the line, it reached a new peak.
Yeah.
So,
yeah.
and I'm
no, that you're certainly right. That adds complexity to the problem. Absolutely.
Yeah.
Good comment. Let's see, Yario.
Thank you, Steve. I have a question to Brian Lin, because I understood that he is suggesting that state can use MMT or it can use public enterprise as a solution for economic sustainability. But what happens if you cannot trust the state too much? If the state is inefficient and plagued with bureaucracy and clientelism? Because this policy would be good if you have an efficient state. But in Latin America, we are kind of hesitant that too much state could be very inefficient. Like in the case of Venezuela, it has been a complete failure. I mean, in Latin America, no one wants to be like the Chavez Maduro model. So what do you say about that?
Brian, go ahead.
Okay. Well, I guess we should not just review the history. We should also plan and design for the future. And then of course, state enterprises or government-owned enterprises probably are not very attractive in Latin America, or probably not very attractive in China for many foreigners. But still, if you look the European case, like the Sweden case, I do feel state enterprises, they are a very good complement, especially during this pandemic area. And of course, we cannot fully trust government to operate a public enterprise in a very efficient manner. But I believe at this point, we just rely on traditional monetary policy, fiscal policy, and that's it. And I guess the government actually owns a lot of resources. The government can implement a lot of measures. And why not we ex-government, just like some European country, probably different country, they operate public enterprise, they will operate in a different manner. But still, I believe, I just do feel even in Taiwan, we have small local enterprises. They do operate in a very good manner. Okay, so they promote the local economy, and also they offer job stability for local people. So I guess we still can design good policy and then ask the government to do more. So I guess it's an open. So my point is not just to nationalize all private enterprise. No, my point is that we should try to promote public enterprises to help us, especially during this crisis, and also to complement the private enterprises, especially they probably do not have a vision, and they just want to make profit. Just some people have already mentioned, yeah. And then we can assign a different duty to public enterprises. Yeah, so that's my short reply. Thank you.
John Marangos?
Thank you,
Hand up.
Steve. Can I please add the Greek experience with state enterprises? It's quite interesting to see that, you know, one of the conditionalities was the wholesale of state enterprises to the private sector to be able to receive funding from the IMF. But what is interesting to see is that people did not resist that sale. Why? Because state enterprises were so inefficient that they were just fed up with them. Okay, and hoping that the sale to a private sector will be able to make these enterprises efficient and, of course, offer the services to the people. Let me give you an example. Is that the state railway system in Greece was sold to an Italian company, which is state-owned, so the state railway company of Italy. And just about a couple of weeks ago, with a law passed from Parliament, the state railway debt of 1.5 billion euros was just wiped off. So not only we sold bankrupt state enterprises, but when the private sector took over, all the debt associated with these state-owned enterprises was wiped off, of course, paid by the Greek taxpayer. Thank you.
Response? Brian? Unmute.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. So just no further reply, but I just feel yeah. After I review the European and like a Swedish case, I think it's time to promote state enterprise to some extent, yeah, to help we design for the future, especially if we want to design, control the future. I believe state enterprises should be a good asset, not a liability to society. If we have a good design for it, yeah, thank you.
Okay, thank you. Anyone else?
Perhaps
No,
one
no.
remark to John Komlos. You mentioned, yeah, may I? Okay.
Yes, go ahead.
Yeah, John, you mentioned life expectancy, which is something that is, in my view, largely undervalued as an economic overall indicator. There are people, of course, saying that life expectancy should perhaps replace even GDP. You know, it's the more general indication of what is under the blanket. It's of meso and micro processes. And I just want to remind of the fact that after the breakdown of the Soviet Union, Russia had for a decade unseen at that time breakdown or decrease of general life expectancies. The general life expectancy is, of course, something that reacts very, very slowly, because it under the blanket it requires billions and billions of micro interactions in order for the big aggregated thing to react. And I see, I mean, what do you Americans tell us about the decrease of life expectancy in the US, which is quite considerable? I mean, 2-3% over a decade or so is spectacular. That is really spectacular, because we never had these relatively large motions of life expectancy in the last century, even, you know, since medicine got a clue of viruses and epidemiology, etc. So since the second half of 19th century, we didn't have that anymore. I think of the opioid crisis on the one hand, and of the COVID crisis, the morbidity under the COVID crisis as a second element. But I would like to hear more of what the Americans know better than myself. Thanks.
Yes, case and Deaton should be considered in this regard. I don't know if you can still see my my screen. Can you see my screen still?
No.
No, let me see if I can go back to it. Case and Deaton think of this as deaths of despair. It's not only the opioid epidemic, but suicides as well, and alcoholism. And this is one of their graphs. And if you can see US whites, these are middle-aged people. And you see the kink here just around 2000. It's very ominous, because in my mind, there is a relationship to the penetration of Chinese imports into the US at that time, the destruction of factories, and that brought with it a kind of helplessness that led to this graph. And as you can see, the US falls way behind other countries in this time period. And I connected also to the rise of populism. People who are in despair are going, not all of them are going to be killing themselves, but some of them are going to rise up against the system which destroy their jobs, let's face it. Okay, so the insurrection of January 6th is also tied in here. It's all one package of what I call high pressure capitalism that destroys lives, and in the process also destroys the social cohesion, and the political system becomes dysfunctional. So this one graph tells me a heck of a lot. And if you look at just the opioid overdoses, there's also another kink here at 2000. You can't disregard that, in my view. So economists have managed to disregard it. They don't pay any attention to it. But I think it tells a lot about what's going on in the United States. I'll stop here for, a lot more to be said.
Let me try to just reframe and extend what John just said. The problems are twofold and related, and they're distributional problems. And the distributional problems in the United States are in large part taking place among people who don't have any college education at all. And the result is the deaths of despair, which John's PowerPoint put up. And the deaths of despair are basically deaths of despair by people at those sort of lower income levels. And so the decline in life expectancy, with which Wolfram started his comments with and asked for some responses, those are not things that are taking place across the board. For highly educated Americans, there's been no change in life expectancy. There's not even been a change in increases in life expectancy.
Right.
All of the change has taken place at the very bottom of the income distribution and the educational distribution, and those two are obviously related.
Yeah,
So I hope that helped. I hope that helped answer Wolfram's question.
Yeah, very interesting. Very interesting.
Well,
John, are these figures all in your book?
No, they're not. Most of them are in Case and Deaton. Case and Deaton's book. But look at this. These are non-college educated folks. This is in 2018 dollars. This goes back to 1970s. They've been clobbered. Okay. They've been clobbered, and obviously they're not going to be happy citizens. So it's not very difficult to figure out the roots of Trumpism. Here's the wealth distribution that Steve was referring to. Here's the bottom half of the population. It got nothing. They got no skin in the game. Okay. This is $20,000 average per household, but that counts their car, their furniture, and their refrigerators. So they got nothing, basically, besides household items. But the top 1%, this is 2019, got 25 million bucks, Wolfram, in the bank, net. You see what I mean, Wolfram? And what Steve meant, this is not an economy that is balanced.
The commercial break of myself, we have in ICAPE, a Mexican colleague, Carol Jill Vasquez, and myself have a paper on death cult. So we try to set up an argument from neoliberalism to the real dimension of death and the ideological dimension, which has something to do with Heidegger's autocratic fascist personality character, and as well with the ideology of taking in my own death and my own self-sacrifice into the struggle for life as they